It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Roger Trigg, who's Professor of Philosophy at Warwick University. He's also on the advisory board for the Faraday Institute, so it's a special pleasure to have him talking to us. He also has been involved in numerous organisations and committees. I think, as are all academics now, it should be in the a warning for a job description. You will have to sit on committees. But he's not only sat on them, he's chaired quite a few of them, including the National Committee for Philosophy. He actually founded the British Philosophical Association, founding chairman of that. British Society for the Philosophy of Religion. He's now president of Mind Association, and lots of other things too. Anyway, we're looking forward very much to you speaking to us, so I won't take any more of your time. Professor Trigg.
Thank you very much. Right, well, it's very good to be here. I thought that, first of all, I ought to explain a little bit about what philosophy is. Now, I do that because whenever I meet scientists, I get the feeling that a lot of them actually get irritated about philosophy, that philosophers get in the way. They start asking silly questions about why and what do you mean. And scientists want to get in and get on with things and do things and not have these wretched people bringing up abstract questions that actually aren't, they think, terribly important. Well, as I indicate at the bottom of the sheet that I hope you all have, I've written a book called Philosophy Matters. So I actually believe philosophy does matter. I believe that it's important. Now, sometimes some of my colleagues, particularly in contemporary philosophy, get caught up with very technical issues, and indeed they sometimes are so concerned about the kind of trees they're dealing with, they never see what kind of wood they're in. And so I can quite see why some people think, well, what is the point of philosophy? Somebody said to me, it's just making simple things appear difficult. Well, is it? Let's go back to Socrates and Plato for a moment. Famously, it was said that all philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato, and indeed, as we heard earlier this morning, Plato's had a tremendous influence on the history of Christian thought. I think there are even Platonic echoes in the New Testament, or that's another story. But certainly he influenced the Greek world, and Christianity was formed in the Greek world. So there's a tremendous influence. Now, what were Socrates and Plato particularly concerned with? Now, Socrates was very intent on asking people, in a sense, what is something? What is, to take the subject of one of the dialogues of Plato, what is knowledge? And that's something that actually will concern us today. What is knowledge? And very typically, people would say, oh, that's easy, we know what knowledge is, you can know how to lay bricks, and you can know how to do this, and you can know how to do that. And Socrates would say, well, yes, you've given me a lot of examples, but what do they have in common? What is it in virtue of which you call them all knowledge? And he'd do the same with virtue or anything like that, piety. It's no good giving lots of examples of virtues, of the virtue of a horse, the virtue of this, the virtue of that. But why are they all virtue? What, in virtue of what? And actually, therefore, what Socrates was doing, and then Plato following him, what they're doing is demanding not that just that we strike forth in language and use it, but we stop and think what we mean, not in a quibbling way about just what does this word mean, what's that mean, but what are the presuppositions at work when we use language, when we think? What are the presuppositions at work when we take part in a particular activity? What has to be the case for this or that activity to be successful? All right, we think science is successful. We can do science. But a philosopher would say, well, now, all right, it's all very well doing it, taking it for granted, taking it for face value, but what has to be the case for us to actually assume that it is possible in the first place? And it's no good really a scientist saying, well, it is possible, we can do it, which is common sense. Common sense is usually the fossilized philosophy of previous generations. Actually, when we're just using our common sense, we're just using the thoughts that we were brought up to think, which is usually what people have in the past actually originally thought and taught others. There's actually always a time lag, even in professional circles, I think, between philosophy and other disciplines, so that you'll find that very often, even when people are using philosophical topics, it tends to be the philosophy of the last generation. That, again, is relevant to what I want to talk about this morning, because when I first went to Oxford, it was still really the heyday of logical positivism. And one of the teachers who influenced me in the sense that I admired the way he did a philosophy, not the conclusions he came to, was A.J. Ayer, in a sense the high priest of humanism at the time, and very much a logical positivist. What is a logical... A.J. Ayer, A-Y-E-R. He wrote a very famous book, still a classic, called Language, Truth and Logic. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Well, what is logical positivism? And I bring this up because it's very much dealing with science. It's dealing with the status of science, and it's really a science-based philosophy. It's taking science as, in a sense, setting the terms for philosophy. I make no apology for saying I think actually philosophy ought to set the terms for science. Now, not in the sense of philosophers telling science what to do, but in the sense that they're finding out the rational underpinning of scientific practice, what scientists actually think. Now, sometimes scientists will say, well, this is what we believe, and I'd say, well, fine, but that actually is a philosophical position, even if you don't realize it. Now, what is logical positivism? I was driving, I live in Stratford-on-Avon. I was driving down to Oxford one day, many years ago, and I stopped, as it was a hot afternoon, I stopped in Woodstock for a cup of tea. And I went into a tea shop, rather a fashion tea shop, and there was only a place at a table where there was no lady sitting, and she was a nosy old lady, and she wanted to know where I was going, what I was doing, and I was actually going to a lecture in Oxford, and she wanted to know what it was on, and I said philosophy, and she said, oh yes, my nephew's a philosopher in Oxford, and she mentioned his name, and I had actually heard of him, and she then said, he's a logical positivist, you know. And I said, well, yes. I thought that's probably a fair description. Well, that wasn't the right reaction. She looked at me piercingly and she said, well, it's not very nice, is it? And of course, to an old lady living in Woodstock, it wasn't. And why not? Well, let's go back to Ayer in Language, Truth and Logic. Ayer was ruling out all of metaphysics, metaphysics in a sense being the study of reality, which in a sense I would say is what science rests on, the assumptions about what reality has to be like. It rules out all of metaphysics, all of aesthetics, all of religion, all of ethics as being truth-stating. Why? Because the only truths are the truths that can be discovered empirically in science. Now, there are also the truths of logic that are true by definition, mathematics and logical truths like all bachelors are unmarried. But logical positivists therefore thought that you either had truths by definition or truths you discover through experience. And in a sense, this is the ultimate science-based philosophy. I mean, they would look back to empiricists like David Hume in the 18th century in Britain. But they were working out basically a view of the world that makes science, understood in our sense of the term, that made science the be-all and end-all for the finding of knowledge. In other words, you don't find knowledge through reason, you don't find knowledge, in a sense, through any other means but empirical investigation. And by empirical we mean through experience, through intersubjective experience, which has to be repeatable and testable. In other words, one's looking for verification and falsification, to use their favourite words. Something has to be verifiable to be meaningful or falsifiable. And later on, Karl Popper modified it and said, well, meaningfulness in science, at any rate, should just be a matter of falsification. If you don't know how something can be disproved, then it isn't meaningful. There is something right about that, of course, because If I say there are lots of heffalumps in my garden, and you say, well, yes, but what are they and what do they look like? And I'd say, I don't know, they're invisible, and but nevertheless they're there. And well, how would you know? And if I can never provide a test for what counts as a heffalump and whether I know one's been there or not, it does look as if I'm not really saying anything. And you see, that insight, pressed, is where you get with verificationism, with logical positivism. That in the end, what one's saying is just that meaning is how you can find out things. Now, actually, logical positivism, I think, doesn't work for science, because you only have to think about modern physics to see that there are plenty of things going on in modern physics that aren't very easy to verify. I mean, I won't go into many universes or anything exotic, but even just something like the other side of the universe or the interior of a black hole, it's pretty difficult to think how you'd empirically verify that. And indeed, in the aftermath of the logical positivism, there was a great idea that actually, of course, theory is prominent, and theories are very much more important than just the data, and theoretical entities can be talked about even if sometimes you can't experience them. In the early 60s, when I was first an undergraduate, actually people like Ayer found even the other side of the moon quite a difficult concept. Now, I mean, you think, well, come on, wait a minute, why would they do that? Now, they would say, well, of course, it's in principle verifiable, we know, but nobody had actually seen it, that's the point. Until 1960, well, late 60s. 1969, of course, people actually landed on the moon. And so at that point, it was very difficult to actually say, well, people have experienced it. And of course, once you begin to slide away from verification to verification in principle, how far do you go? That begins to let in a very great deal. Going completely on one side for a moment, the philosopher of religion, John Hick, said, well, of course, there's such a thing as eschatological verification, because when we'll die, our beliefs may be verified because we may find ourselves in the presence of God. Well, that wouldn't be verification according to Ayer and co., because that's not empirical verification. But it just shows that once you begin to emphasize the notion of in-principle verification, it can get attenuated and attenuated and attenuated. Anyway, the verification principle, I think, has had a tremendous influence. In other words, that meaning is the method of verification. If you can't verify something, so it can't be meaningful. So God exists isn't meaningful. It's just like saying ooga booga bonk or something. It's just noise, because you specify what it would be to say, to find God, check God, say he exists. And in that sense, then, logical positivism was both demanding clarity, but sweeping aside an awful lot even of human experience, because people would, in fact, want to say rather more than they're allowed to say in logical positivism. Now, I'm emphasizing this a lot because I think logical positivism still lives on in lots of circles, and you find it still influencing the social sciences. I mean, in a way, the idea that, in a sense, the only thing that matters is what can be measured. Performance indicators in hospitals or something like that are, in a way, pushing empiricism and logical positivism not too far. I mean, if you can't check it, it isn't there, more or less. And so the tremendous emphasis on measurement, observation. The real is what can be observed. The real is what can be measured. If you can't measure it, if you can't observe it, it isn't there. And as you can see, I mean, an absolute kind of ridiculous travesty of this is just in its end, if you can't put something into monetary terms, it isn't at all meaningful to talk about it. But to go back to science, this is going to create a very narrow view of the rationality of science. It makes science prior, it makes experience prior, but it doesn't allow you actually to stand back and talk about science and say, but can science itself be justified? It isn't the kind of question that can be asked. Following logical positivism, I mean, thinkers like Wittgenstein, in his later philosophy, began to talk about language games and forms of life and say, well, this language game is played, so you do science, you do religion, you do something else, you play according to the rules. People from outside can't criticize. But again, there isn't any notion of reason there. You don't stand outside the language game, the form of life, and reason about it. And I think that when I talk about the rationality of science, I'm not just saying that science is the epitome of rationality, that science expresses the highest form of human rationality. I actually would like to know, why is science itself to be regarded as rational? What grounds science? What justifies science? Now, as I've said, the logical positivists wouldn't want to answer that question. There is another group of philosophers who've been strong over the last century or so, particularly in the United States, and they're pragmatists. Now, in a way, I think probably a lot of working scientists are pragmatists, because I suppose you could summarize the view as saying the important thing is whether something works or not. And, I mean, you go into the laboratory and it all works out. Why bother about all this highfalutin philosophy about worrying about the whys and the wherefores? You do it and something comes of it. If I can give an illustration of the pragmatist distrust, again, of metaphysics, which the logical positivists found meaningless. William James went on a camping expedition in the 19th century to upstate New York. And he went off for a walk, and he came back to find his friends having a tremendous argument. And the argument was about a squirrel. And I don't know how many of you watch the antics of squirrels, because squirrels are pretty much the same. I mean, you see them in Cambridge doing this. If you see them going up a tree, and then you go round the tree to try and catch them up, the squirrel will very often go round to make sure the trunk of the tree is between you and it, so it doesn't want you to catch it up. Now, if you do that and go round the trunk of the tree while the squirrel is going round, are you going round the squirrel? Now, this was the argument that William James' friends were having. And to William James, it was a typical example of what he regarded as a metaphysical argument. Nothing hung on it. Everybody agreed on the facts. Everybody agreed they were going around the trunk of the tree. The squirrel was going around the trunk of the tree. Nothing changed, whatever you said. And William James would say, well, what difference does it make? What difference does it make? And that's the pragmatist view, really. Bertrand Russell was a bit dismissive of American pragmatism. I mean, he thought it was typical of American commercialism, which was perhaps an unfair jibe. But certainly the idea that you can get down to earth, and if it doesn't actually make a real difference in the real world, what's the point of it? And again, that's the tough-minded view of metaphysics. It's arguing about something that actually doesn't latch onto anything. It doesn't make you change your view. Not sure about that, actually. I think that if one does change one's metaphysics sometimes, it might change what you're looking for, or even your desire to look for something, and that's perhaps rather important. So you've got these two very strong currents of philosophy, positivism and pragmatism, each allied in their total distrust of metaphysics, in talking about reality, and therefore in talking about reasoning about reality in any kind of vacuum, as they might think. So, in other words, science, therefore, is thought to be important in its own right. Science delivers the goods. It's sometimes I feel it's a kind of non-stick frying pan view of science, that actually, why worry about the whys and wherefores if you can actually produce what you want? And the theory behind the theories doesn't matter. One interesting thing, I mean, I've been talking about science all the time in a very English kind of way. By science, I'm talking about the physical sciences. I'm talking about empirical science, in other words, what we discover through observation and experiment. But that is a comparatively recent view of, because if you think of the word science, it's actually the Latin word scientia, which is the Latin for knowledge. And I think the way in which scientia has become science is itself says something about our culture, about the way in which knowledge has been narrowed to what we can see and touch and feel and measure. And that's a very, very questionable presupposition. And that does make a difference to the way people live their lives. I mean, of course, if I was talking to you in German and was talking to you about Wissenschaft, it would be very different. I always get a bit put out when I go to international congresses and Germans get up and speak in fluent English, as I could never speak in fluent German, but they speak in fluent English, but they're still thinking in a Germanic way, and they talk about this scientific congress. And I think, scientific? It isn't scientific, I'm doing philosophy. But for them, philosophy is a science, it's a structured discipline dealing with knowledge. They have a much wider view of what could be knowledge than we in this very narrow sense of science. But still, when I'm talking about the rationality of science, I mean the rationality of the empirical sciences. But the fact that we've narrowed it like that should be a warning. Why have we narrowed the word? Why have we cut out so many other areas of human experience? And does that somehow impoverish our thought? Certainly what's happened is that we've had a premium put on the fact of human knowledge, and it is often assumed that science, in a sense, sets the standard for rationality. I mean, when we talk about the rationality of science, actually, what's being said, really, is that science is rationality. The scientific method is rationality at work. There is no other way of thinking. And that is a very big claim indeed. So it's again narrowing not just the notion of science, but the notion of reason. Is reason only what we can experience and systematize as a result of our experience? Actually, I don't believe even the physical sciences progress in that way, because you need, in a sense, a metaphysical vision, a vision of what could be right, in order to do science in the first place. And that's really the conclusion I want to be getting to over the next half hour or so, that actually science has to operate within a metaphysical framework to give it any sense. I don't know what scientists think they're doing other than just earning their money if they don't operate within a metaphysical framework. Of course, they may not be doing it very consciously, but they are doing it nevertheless. Now, there's quite a long tradition, going back to the 17th century, of taking science at face value. John Locke, the 17th century philosopher, thought of philosophy as indeed an underlabourer to science. He felt he was an underlabourer to Newton. But I think he was being unnecessarily modest, and I don't think he actually really believed that. Because although Locke was certainly an empiricist philosopher, he was also very much a Christian philosopher, and he believed very strongly that God was the source of reason, and reason was grounded in God. So he wasn't taking science as being something that was locked off from everything else and you could only operate within science. Science itself was working in a larger context. But as I said, I think science needs itself a wider context, a wider understanding. And this does raise the issue, which is fascinating to discuss, and I haven't got a quick answer. But why does science flourish at some times in some places and not others? Why have some cultures produced science and other cultures not? Obviously, one's in very controversial areas here. An extreme view would say that it is because of Christianity that science has developed, empirical science. But certainly in the 17th century, it's undeniably true that it was in a Christian context that modern science developed, particularly here in Cambridge, that in fact traditionally people thought, well, what is necessary, what has to be the case? The Greeks were, I think, always much happier with dealing with things like geometry, where they could think of necessary truth and mathematics, rather than observation and experiment. And we can have a long discussion about how far they've relied on observation and experiment at all. But certainly they were happier in thinking of the rationality of necessary truth than the rationality of the contingent world. If you do empirical science, you have to be very well aware of the rationality of the contingent world, of the world that could be other than it is. In other words, why do science in a laboratory rather than just sitting in an armchair at home? Now, that's not a silly question, because I think even in Aristotle you find a lot of thinking which would suggest that he was thinking about what has to be the case, what perfection has to be, rather than just going out and looking to see how things actually do work. And so Plato himself, of course, following Pythagoras, as we heard this morning, certainly believed that ultimately everything is mathematically, rationally structured, but in a necessary way. I mean, once you get into mathematics, of course, you're dealing in necessary truth, not with things that could have worked in a different way. In science, physical science, you're dealing with what I would term contingent truth. 2 and 2 can't equal 5, but it could be raining now. And that's the difference between necessary truth that can't be otherwise and contingent truth, the world of change. And science is dealing with empirical science is dealing with contingent truth. It can't assume that things have to be in a particular way. Now, if that's so, that means that you really have to conduct experiments and observations to look to see how in fact they are made. And I think obviously the notion of contingency is linked very much with the notion of empirical science, because if you know what things have to be like, you don't need to go and look to see if they are like that. If you're not sure how they are, then you have to go and look. But there is a problem about contingency, because if everything is changing, if everything, as Heraclitus, a pre-Socratic philosopher, said, is in flux, then there's no order, no stability, no structure, no regularity. So the problem about contingency is that it can easily collapse into total chaos. So in other words, for science to make any sense, you have to assume you can make sense of the contingency. That you look at the world, because it doesn't have to be like that, but there is a structure, a regularity, an order, a sense in it. Now, why would there be? Now, in the 17th century, particularly, thinkers had a view of a God who was free to create the world in any way he wished. So that meant you had to look at the world to see how he had created it. He didn't have to create it one way rather than another. But at the same time, because it is, according to this theological view, the creation of God, you would expect there to be some rationality in it. Now, this notion of rationality in the world is I think, a very deep one, and goes back to Greek philosophy, as we were hearing this morning. And one word that I think is very important here is the word logos. Now, this has resonances right back before Plato. I mean, I mentioned Heraclitus saying everything's in flux, but he did think there was a rationale, a logos in things, holding things in balance. Plato was looking always for the logos in things. And it's no coincidence that what was quoted earlier in questions this morning, with the beginning of St. John's Gospel uses that word. In the beginning was the logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. So right at the beginning of St. John's Gospel, you have the statement that God and rationality are synonymous. I mean, that is putting together Greek philosophy and the doctrine of creation in a very, very strong way. And in thinking of the resonances of the word logos, I mean, which must have been meant in that chapter, the logos, being identified with Christ, is also identified with a very rationale, the order, the structure within the universe. So this world is a world that we can make sense of. And so the contingency of the world is balanced by the order that is in it. We, I think, therefore, can look, if we follow this view, at the world. We have to look at the world to find out how it's been made, but we can look at it with some confidence that there is a sense to be made out of it. The intelligibility of the world, the comprehensibility of the world, is something that should not be taken for granted. Now, logical positivism and pragmatism never address these questions. In fact, I mean, they'd think, well, they're unanswerable questions. Logical positivism had a wonderful get-out for all of this, that if a question is unanswerable or insoluble, it isn't a meaningful question. So therefore it can't be asked in the first place. It's a wonderful way of limiting one's vision. You can only ask questions you know how to answer. Actually, I don't think science would have progressed itself if you really not. You'd be just trapped within your present vision. And still, unless you started worrying about things you couldn't answer and couldn't see how to answer, I don't see how sometimes you couldn't have had some of the great revolutions in science that once had. And even now, I mean, surely the most interesting things in science and in physics in particular are the things that don't seem to have an answer, indeed can barely be systematized in a question, but one feels that somehow, there, that we are reaching out for something and haven't quite got there. But to go back to the issue of intelligibility, I think that this can't be taken for granted. I mean, it was Einstein who said something like the most incomprehensible thing about the world is its comprehensibility. And comprehensibility means two things. One, that the world is ordered. But of course the other thing, which is I think very interesting, is that the world is ordered in such a way that we can understand it. So there are two questions to answer there. Why is it that the world does have an intrinsic order? Assuming that it does, but I think if it doesn't, science is in big trouble. Or why is it that we can grasp that order with human minds? Now, of course, one way is to say, well, it's all chaos in a sense, it's all just what the order that we apparently see is just the projection of the human mind, and basically it's illusory. Which is in the end saying, well, science, it doesn't give us the knowledge we think it does. And this is, I think, why actually it's quite important for us to begin to answer some of these philosophical questions or face them, rather than just do science. There are people, and I'll talk again in another lecture about this, there are people who challenge the whole question of the rationality of science. And so unless one knows why it's justified, science itself can be in big trouble. At its extreme, science can just seem, and I mentioned Wittgenstein earlier, like just one game amongst many. And so some people play cricket, some like American football, I don't understand why. Some people like soccer, etc., etc. And, well, you pays your money and you takes your choice. It's not like saying, as perhaps I'd like to say, that actually in the kind of metaphysically correct world, cricket is the one thing that everybody should play. So one can't say cricket is the truth and everything else is wrong. It's just one game, even I have to admit that. And, you know, some people like it. If you play the game, you've got to play by the rules. So there's a way of doing science. There are rules for doing science. You're not doing science if you behave in certain ways. But why do it? Well, it's what some people like. Some people like watching 5 days, watching a test match, and then in the end it's all drawn. But some people don't. Some people like dressing up in white coats and going down and so prancing around smelly places. I mean, and some people don't. Why? And Some people like going to church. Some people like religion. So we've got to be very careful, I think, not to just say, well, that's what's done. And pragmatists can get into this problem, I mean, because all right, it's a practice. But if you can't justify or legitimate a practice, any practice is as good as any other. Actually, Wittgenstein himself ran into this problem in his later work because he couldn't justify physics. He was worried about why, for instance, he would say physics was a good thing to believe in and believing in oracles wasn't. And he recognized that people who believed in physics would call the oracle believers all kinds of names, but in the end he'd say, well, it is just a matter of throwing slogans at one another. You're in one system of belief or another. Ultimately, physics can't be justified. And I think that's a very, very worrying position to get into. So ultimately, I mean, Wittgenstein would have accepted this in his book on certainty. Ultimately, physics is no better than astrology. Astronomy, astrology, who pays you money, who takes your choice. Some people do one, some the other. You can't say this is right. You can, within the game, say, well, this is how you should do it. But you can't actually say this is right any more than I, at a cricket match, can say baseball is false, superstitious, blah, blah, blah. You can't say that kind of thing. It's just a game. But do we want to say science is just a game? Surely we want to say something more that... I mean, my problem is that I want to say that science is about the real world and is a rational process, but I don't want to say it's the only way of finding out about the real world and it defines reason. So one's got to take a middle course there. Just to go back for a moment to the 17th century, I mentioned Locke, and they were facing the question of the comprehensibility of the world and how we can understand the world. And as we're in Cambridge, I can just perhaps make a little excursion into some of my favourite thinkers, really, the Cambridge Platonists. Now, they did influence the start of modern science. Some of them, there were a group of philosophers and theologians here in Cambridge. Some of them were fanciful portrayals of them in the stained glass of Emmanuel College Chapel, where several of them were fellows. And they were amongst the founders of the Royal Society. So, I mean, we are talking about people who actually were playing a definite role in the foundation of science. And they had a slogan. One of them, their leaders, Benjamin Whichcote, who was Provost of King's at one point, was particularly known for this slogan. It actually comes from Proverbs, but in English it's reason is the candle of the Lord. Reason is the candle of the Lord. It's I think, a very nice phrase. It was a very influential phrase. It was a phrase John Locke uses at one point. It's a phrase I've come across in John Wesley, who read the Cambridge Platonists. So it did echo on down the years. And it's important because it roots rationality not in ourselves, not in just human ability to observe and experiment, not in human capability alone, but in the fact that we are made in the image of God, that rationality in human beings is in some small way reflecting the rationality of the Creator. Obviously there is a lot that can be said about this, particularly from a contemporary point of view, but one can see how it would influence the development of science, because it would give you an assurance not just that the world could be understood, but that we, as humans, are in a position to be able to understand it, that we share in the rationality of the Creator who imprinted his rationality in the order of the world. But notice, and I think this is a rather important point, notice that reason is the candle of the Lord. Now, we don't use candles so much nowadays, but of course, candles aren't powerful searchlights. They're pale, flickering lights that cause shadows, that they don't give tremendous illumination. They give an illumination that can be trusted, but they also make us very aware of the darkness around, and they don't enable us to see things too well. So if you believe reason is the candle of the Lord, you're not going to be, I think, terribly arrogant about things. You're going to realize that our knowledge is at best highly partial. And of course that's a very important point in science as well, that I think science only progresses because of a tremendous understanding that the knowledge that we have is partial at best. All right, yes, perhaps we can gain a grip on the world in some ways, but it's only a very, in a sense, pale and faltering vision of things, rather than a full, clear look at everything. So, if reason is the candle of the Lord, we have some grounds for trusting in our abilities, but also a great deal of grounds for humility as well. And I think that one of the problems about going to go back to logical positivism is that actually it didn't pay enough attention to what we don't know. It was all building on our knowledge, and it wasn't aware enough of the tremendous area that we don't know. We heard last lecture all about dark matter, etc. And that just illustrates the fact that science actually needs an understanding of what isn't known as well as what is. It needs a certain humility in order to progress. Indeed, without it, science will stultify, because if we already know everything, if we've systematized everything, if we've got everything straight, what's the point of doing anything else anyway? Now, one of the points about the comprehensibility of the world, of course, is that we can assume a basic uniformity of nature, so that the same kind of physical processes occur everywhere. I think one of the problems when we look at religion as opposed to science, and we'll be talking about religion later on, but one of the problems is that, of course, science can claim a universality, and I think if we want rationality, we assume rationality can claim universality. That this is, in a sense, the Enlightenment view of rationality, I suppose, but it's always been the view that if a reason is a good reason, it's a good reason for anyone, anywhere, at any time. Now, this has enormous repercussions, because it means that if you do science in Washington, and it's good science, it ought to be valid in Beijing. If you do science in Moscow, it ought to be all right in London. In other words, there is one universal science. And that, I think, is an enormous insight that perhaps we can take too easily for granted. And again, attacks on the rationality of science from outside can begin to undermine this and suggest that science is purely local, a matter of one tradition. But that isn't what I was nearly going to say Western science believes, but notice that that adjective, Western science, is already beginning to fall into the trap, because what we are claiming about science is that if it's true everywhere at all times. That does mean that if you go to Africa, for instance, and you believe in the scientific basis of your medicine, the medicine ought to work there as well as here. So it isn't enough for people to say, well, it's not their tradition, they trust witch doctors, we trust antibiotics, but that's all that you can say about it. Science makes universal claims which can be checked universally and which hold universally. And that, I think, is a very strong and important notion for science. At the same time, although universality is important and we think that nature is uniform and that nature applies everywhere, in fact, I mean, so much so that we can generalize from here to everywhere, from now to all times. I mean, how is it that physics is possible? How can we talk about the universe and what happens beyond our reach unless we're very confident in our ability to generalize in the universal claims of science? So it isn't just a matter of what we discover here holding for other people somewhere else. It's that what humans discover can be generalized beyond human experience. And this is again, of course, is where logical positivism will fall down, because they want to relate everything to human experience. But science, of course, wants to generalize that physical theory is trying to go beyond experience and actually even talk about what perhaps could be experienced in theory at the other side of the universe, but obviously no one ever will, even in principle. But it's universalized in that way. So from that point of view, science is making not just global claims, but universal claims in the strict sense of the term. I mean, it's talking about the universe. I'm never very happy when it talks about many universes. I want to reach for Occam's razor, but that's another story. But when, in fact, we're talking about the universality of science, I'd like to introduce just one other term, and that's the objectivity of science. Now, you might say it's much the same, but science is talking about something which is objective. And if successful, it's referring to something that is the case independently of what we think. In the last section of the summary I've given out, claims about the nature of reality, even that there is such a thing, realism, are metaphysical. They extend beyond empirical knowledge. Reality is something that is there whatever we think about it. It is objective, as opposed to intersubjective. I mean, again, the logical positivists were talking about experience, my experience, your experience. They're talking about building up a picture of the world through human experience. But that's relating reality to us. It's making reality anthropocentric. Reality depends on what we think. It's almost a kind of idealism. I mean, the extreme version of which is, the clock isn't ticking in the room if there's no one there to listen to it. Or even the clock isn't there if you don't see it. But from my point of view, what I'm wanting to emphasize is the objective reality of the world. Now, this is actually the indispensable presupposition of science before you get started, really, the realism, which, of course, a lot of physicists and others will say, of course we're realists when you mention that. Of course, and we just take that for granted. We still don't have any trouble with philosophy, but we're realists. But of course that is a philosophical theory that they need. They may think it's obvious, but it isn't obvious to a lot of people nowadays. But the idea that there is an independent reality that we're investigating that holds for all people, that doesn't necessarily depend on our beliefs about it, that isn't constructed out of our beliefs about it, that it isn't a reflection of our beliefs, is enormously important. It's almost like looking down a well and seeing your reflection and thinking you're seeing something. Is science just that? Are we seeing the reflection of the workings of our own minds? Now, actually, I think that the whole raison d'etre of science is that we're not building up fancy intellectual structures. We're actually looking at the way the world is. Now, in the jargon, that's called metaphysical realism, and I introduce the term metaphysical advisedly, because it's the most important presupposition underlying all of science. I've mentioned others, I mean, the uniformity of nature, etc., its comprehensibility. But the most basic one of all is that there is just this reality. And that isn't totally obvious, is the fact that it has been denied time and time again through the history of philosophy. I'll talk about postmodernism on another occasion, but this is an argument that in a sense galvanized Plato. He was up against the relativists of his time, who said, in the guise of Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. In other words, what we think goes. It's we who are important, not reality. And Plato would say, no, it's the real world that's important, and the question is, what is real? And one of the fundamental philosophical issues is always, how do you separate out appearance from reality? But nevertheless, the real world is the target of our attempts to find knowledge, and the real world exists for all of us everywhere. It is real independently of what we think, what we believe, what we talk about, it's independent of our language. And of course the corollary of this, and this is why some people don't like metaphysical realism, is that because it's independent of us, we can be wrong about it. We could even be rather radically wrong. And so the seeds of skepticism come in. I mean, it is worrying to think that perhaps we could be wrong about everything. Of course, that's where the notion of reason being the candle of the Lord perhaps comes in, actually. That might give one a certain degree of confidence, given, at any rate, a particular religious belief. But certainly, in this whole area, the very idea that there's a gap between the object of knowledge and the people knowing is worrying for some philosophers. And yet, to me, it's actually what provides the motive for science. Because if we already know, if we've already got within our grasp what the world is like, if it's just a reflection of our thoughts, then our first thoughts are likely to be as good as our last, because there's no difference anyway. It's only because the world is complex, although perhaps ultimately comprehensible, maybe sometimes difficult to understand, it's challenging. It's only because of that that surely science is itself worth doing. So, in that way then, realism provides the framework in which science can operate. Now, you need more than realism, because you need not just the notion of reality, but the idea of what kind of reality and why we should be able to understand it, why we, as humans, should be able to understand it. But ultimately, I mean, the most crucial thing is just this idea that there is a real world. It isn't something that we make up. In other words, science is a matter of discovery, not invention. Of discovery, not construction. We're not constructing elaborate theories. We're not constructing models, and that's all. Unless the models are of something, unless the theories are about something, unless they somehow get in touch with the real world, then what's the point of science? Now, coming back to the title of what I'm talking about, the rationality of science, really what I'm wanting to say is that actually the best of all reasons for believing something is that something is true, that rationality, in the end, is intrinsically connected with the idea of reality. That what one can be rational and wrong sometimes, of course, we can have apparently good reasons, but nevertheless, in the end, the point about reasoning is to get in touch with the real world and what things really are. That rationality, as I've said, isn't just a matter of constructing lovely edifices. Without the idea of reality, in other words, without the idea of truth, there is no point, not just in science, but no point in any intellectual activity. Indeed, the alternative is nihilism. And in case you think that's a knockdown argument, unfortunately there are a lot of nihilists around nowadays who rather glorify in it. So it's a challenge. I used to think almost it was a reductio ad absurdum of an argument to say, well, the alternative is nihilism, but I think that some people are willing to say, yes, that's fine, I'm a nihilist. I think it's an ultimately contradictory position, but still, just as relativism is is ultimately contradictory, as we'll see again. So, rationality and truth are intrinsically related. Truth isn't just a property of linguistic statements, or ultimately it's to do with the relationship of what we think and believe and the real world. I'm not going to go into philosophical arguments about the nature of truth, but ultimately science is in the business of discovering truth. Now, science isn't, I think, something that has monopoly rights on truth. It doesn't contain the whole truth, but it is about truth. And that, to me, would seem to me one of the prime motives for doing science, to discover what is true, at least in a particular area. Take away the notion of truth, and I don't know quite what's going on. So ultimately science, yes, is rational. Unless you believe it the only source of truth, you won't think that it defines rationality. But certainly the idea that rationality is itself something that can perhaps ground science is, I think, an idea worth pursuing. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Roger. That's a good lead into the next talk, which is truth-telling in doing science. So it's open to questions. Can you get a microphone, please? And
I think it will be good to put in 4 categories to arrange mind and external world in order to understand why there is rationality in the world. I think first will be too good that we have as concept some intuition, a priori intuitions in our mind. Without this, I think the rationality will be impossible as intuition of a space or maybe time, for example. I think it is the first sine qua non of rationality. I think the second will be to say that except that intuitions, we have some capacity in our mind. Maybe we can have that intuitions, but if we haven't memory as such. For example, if our memory was a capacity of having 1,000 pictures, for example, again without that capacity, it will be impossible to have a rationality of the as it is now. So I should like to divide this in, for example, for mind, intuitions and capacity are 2 sine qua nons of rationality as we are speaking. I think for external world, we can have such a division. For example, firstly, having natural laws, but I don't mean only for science having rational laws. In general, for knowledge having some rational laws is one of sine qua nons of rationality as well. For example, when somebody is cooking, whenever they put water on fire, if they didn't see it is repeated, they cannot cook. Or whenever I say that this is 3, for example, if every time when I say 3, the persons cannot hear the same word. If the same physical laws didn't exist always, they cannot hear it again. Language will be impossible and rationality will be impossible. I think so. Having this as a third, we can say that this is another sine qua non of rationality. I think as a fourth, we can say that again we can have natural laws, but the natural laws can be as such that we cannot understand them. They can be so complex. For example, when we say 3, it can be here some place in Oxford, and it can have a mathematics in it. Or whenever we cook here something, there can a fire someplace other can boil. But it can have its mathematics that we cannot understand. So, except having natural laws, the arrangement of it that it can have some, it can be understood with our mind. The degree of their complexity is another sine qua non of rationality. And I think that for these 4, to have some arrangement together, to have some harmony, and the harmony of these 4 items, I think, is the sine qua non of rationality. And I think that it can be only explained with a transcendental arrangement. And I think that so an argument from rationality maybe can be established. That's all.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, there's a lot there. Could I just pick up the idea of intuition that you mentioned at the beginning? Because, of course, that could sound a bit like what Kant says, and
Yes.
one's got to be very careful there that then the whole emphasis on explanations of rationality aren't put in the human mind, and then before long you get to the position that our understanding is a question about what we can think rather than about the reality we're thinking about, which of course was precisely Kant's problem, that in the end he couldn't get us in touch with things in themselves, noumena. It was all phenomena, things as they appear to us, so it became very anthropocentric. So I mean, I'm not saying you're saying this, but there is a danger in emphasizing that it becomes an exercise almost in a kind of human psychology, and it's about us. I haven't talked at all about evolution and evolutionary epistemology. There's a lot that could be said about that, but again, the emphasis is very much on us and how we think rather than on what
Yes.
we think about. And I think there are great dangers there.
Yes. I know that Kant's intuitions, but he didn't
Yes.
solve the part of an argument from rationality. Maybe
Yeah.
he just tried to do just the opposite, to show that pure mind is not capable for dealing with this, just the opposite. But again, I think that what his capability of showing that without that intuitions in our mind, it's impossible to have rationality, I think. But I think it's again, although he didn't use in this ways, and Newton's determinism, Newton didn't use in this ways, but many people did it after. I think again that without that intuitions in our mind, the rationality is impossible. And again, although Kant didn't think it to use in this way, I think that we can use it in this way.
Well, I mean, some people would give an evolutionary explanation for intuitions
Yes,
in
yes,
our
I
mind.
do.
Obviously, that would be one
Yes.
explanation. I mean, perhaps. I mean, the question is how far it gets us. But obviously, we through the development of the species could have developed
Yes.
certain intuitions that are born in us. I mean, it's very interesting.
I can say I have some point for it. Maybe I didn't want to mention it.
Yes.
My point is, for evolution, natural selection only can work when something is capable of having some advantage, and natural selection can select other things, and which advantage can survive. But for intuition, for example, half intuition of time, 90% intuition of space doesn't work. Only when we have full intuitions they can work. So I think showing that natural selection can work, selectors, I think is impossible. And because of it, that intuitions which we have in our mind, and saying that they have I think will not make sense for me. I don't know for whom it will make.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
Come to the front row for this trio.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I have several questions, but I will. Notion of universality of science, and that's a very good point. Physics, the way it works here in Cambridge, and it will be working the same way in other places also. Now, I was raised with the idea that religious faith and practice has also got some universal nature, in the sense that if I just believe and practice in the way a Muslim does practice, I will be coming to the same kind of, or the co-religious experience, and which is something like, for example, that the Buddhist monks and the Christian nuns, when they meditate, exactly the way they are asked to meditate, their specked images are amazingly similar. And I am aware of one thing, which is Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Research Center, where the findings about 6,000 British people here, that the co-religious experience is amazingly similar across ethnicity, culture, religion, language, whatsoever. So, I mean, what our teachers say, it will be interesting. If Richard Dawkins in Oxford is invited to meditate just the way they are doing, probably his specked images will be exactly similar, or much closer to what the Buddhist monks and the Christian nuns will be showing. So are we coming to an era where now it is empirically kind of verifiable that there is co-religious experience, universal in nature, across denominations, and we may find more similarities than differences?
Yeah, so that's very interesting and important. But, of course, if you look at science, what I was saying wasn't just that we have the same experiences in Beijing or Tehran or London, but that the theories hold there. I mean, that it isn't that quantum mechanics is all right for Christians but not for Muslims, or something like that. I mean, the theory itself put on the experiences has to hold. So the universality is not just on the observation and the measurement and the data, but actually, in the sense, the interpretation put on the data. If the American interpretation is different from the Chinese interpretation, one of them's wrong, and they've got to argue about it. Now, what do we say about religion? I mean, this is the tricky thing. Even if we say, all right, there is a core of definite religious experience, it's interpreted differently, probably described differently, it certainly then is used differently in different religions. So in a sense, the theory doesn't hold in the same way. I mean, what does one say? And so I think there is a difficulty there. I'll talk more about truth and religion again, but I think I just would like to put a marker there that it isn't an easy issue, because one doesn't resolve anything by saying that there's a core experience, because there's still disagreement about, well, is it Christ who's appearing to me, or is it this, or is it that, or and so on.
And that's certain to be natural, because science is more, measurement of quantity, numbers, figures, where religious experience is more with conscious experience of quality, meaning, value. So the realms of the reality are different. So there might be some overlapping common zone, and also some independent areas where things could come into contact, but not exactly the same.
Yes. I mean, one thing that I'm sure about that ought to be the case for both science and religion is we all live in the same world.
Exactly.
So we're all reacting to the same world. Now, I think we'll leave that as a question just for the moment, because I think it's a big issue.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. You said that we see things somehow darkly and in a clouded way. Do you have any intuition for how far we can go with science? Is there? I mean, there are limits, obviously, but.
Yes. I mean, it is very interesting to think about what the limits would be, and in a sense, it's a bit difficult for us to say what we don't know, because this is a thing Plato would say. Well, I mean, if you can't really say what you're totally ignorant of, but I think that the idea that there is a whole area we don't know is itself a tremendous spur to scientific progress. So I think the mere knowledge of our ignorance ought to be a spur, and I don't know. I mean, there are limits, because I think we're limited. I think perhaps we ought to start with that. Put it in a more theological phrase. I mean, we're finite. I mean, but that finite just means limited. We're limited by time. We're limited by space. So we're here. We're now. And even if it isn't just us, humans are on this planet. So there are limits to how far we can reach out into the universe. That whatever probes and goodness knows what we produce, the size of the universe presumably means that there are going to be real physical limits to what we can ever actually grasp. And there's always the issue, I suppose, which, it's the problem of induction really, whether what we don't see and what we don't observe is like what we do. Now, I've been arguing that we ought, in a sense, science has to assume it is, but we have to take seriously the fact that human beings are limited. And going back to logical positivism, I always felt that they didn't actually place enough emphasis on the limits of human knowledge, because they made human capabilities define knowledge. So that meant you couldn't really talk about the limits of knowledge. Because, in a sense, as I said, what's insoluble isn't a problem. Or what we can't observe, what's unobservable isn't there. And I think that is profoundly debilitating. Just, I suppose, in summary to the question, the most basic limit is just the limits of being human, I think, and our position in the universe.
Did you want to say something, Brian?
I wanted to ask a question, yes. Thank you. I very much enjoyed your talk and sympathize with a great deal of it. I'd like to ask about your notion of universality. You talked about science being the same in Washington and Beijing, and ultimately you seem to generalize this universality to all times as well. I think many Christians traditionally would have thought your universality was a bit strong, maybe making trouble for creation, for the resurrection of Christ, or for any sort of eschatological hope. So how, if at all, would you envision fitting those sorts of doctrines into the presuppositions for the rationality of science?
Perhaps there's a bit of misunderstanding about what's meant by universality here. I mean, I don't quite see. I mean, if with regard to those doctrines as claiming truth, then I suppose you would say that they're true universally, even if they're about things that happened locally or at one time. But is that an answer? But when I was talking about universal truth in science, I mean, obviously, one's talking about truth that applies at all times and all places.
Well, if you allow reference to
wouldn't one say it's the same about religion?
well, if you allow reference to specific places and times, you can probably make almost any sort of claim universal in a Pickwickian sense. So, and that's standard philosopher's trick,
Yes.
I suppose. But
Well, you can trivialize the point, obviously, yes.
so I guess I'm
but-
still puzzled.
But in what way? How would the universality of science not be a good model for talking about universality of truth of doctrine?
Well, because certain doctrines, if one accepts them, may make claims about what happened at the time when, say, Christ was raised from the dead, and that doesn't seem to be what dead bodies usually do, or what they pretty much ever do.
Yes, but in other words, you're talking about, particular historical events.
Yes.
But that's true of all history. We're talking about particular events. I mean, we're not talking about general laws or whatever. But that doesn't mean those things didn't happen or may not have a significance.
Well, no, but most events aren't prima facie a threat to the universality of, or the uniformity of nature in the way that resurrections are.
I mean, are you saying that my claim about the universality and uniformity of science threatens these doctrines? Is that what
Yes.
you're saying?
That's how it seems to me.
Right. Well, I certainly didn't mean to be saying that. I mean, in the sense that I don't. Well, again, this goes back to one's issues about views about regularity and order, and I mean, I don't think that has to be invariant just because things are generally structured and ordered so that they're comprehensible. It doesn't mean that you're in an iron-bound determinism, which is different. I mean, at no point did I talk about determinism or that things had to be as they are, or in any sense. In fact, the more you emphasize the contingency of things, that things could be otherwise, the more you raise the question that sometimes they may not be as you think they will be. I mean, you can still think that there's a general rationality and regularity there, but it needn't be an absolutely ironclad necessity. Indeed, I was distinguishing necessity and contingency.
Well, the issue here is not modality; it's what happens in
Yes.
the actual world at all places and all times, or just most.
But
places
just
and
because
times.
things tend to happen in science is possible, and that we know that, for instance, medicine can cure diseases with certain way. I mean, by and large, we can do this and we can do that, and there are regularities. It doesn't mean that will always happen, or that there couldn't be a miraculous cure, or that something else doesn't happen. I mean, you see, I don't think that. I don't have a view of natural law as being an absolutely ironclad thing. I mean, the more you look at the contingency of the world, the more you think that, in a sense, I would think that natural law is more a description of what tends to happen, of propensity and disposition. So that means that there is a certain structure and regularity there, but it doesn't mean that things have always to be like that. And I don't see, to come back to us, I firmly actually believe, both as a matter of common sense and perhaps as a matter of theological doctrine, in human free will. That doesn't mean we can't live in the world understanding how people tend to behave and what people tend to do and what they're like. It was David Hume who said if you drop a purse of money at Charing Cross at midday and go back for it, you are not likely to find it. And that was true in the 18th century, and I've no doubt it's true today. I mean, I passed through Charing Cross yesterday and all the crowds rushing around, and I'm sure that I wouldn't give it 5 minutes. And people wouldn't bother to take it to a police station either. So that's human nature. But that doesn't mean that people aren't free and responsible. We can know tendencies, dispositions, predict people's behaviour, understand what it's like to be human. I mean, there is this tension between human nature and a kind of determinist view, which, of course, there's a lot of argument about all of that. But I strongly believe that we're constrained, just as the physical world is constrained. But constraint and influence isn't determinism. And so that means that, and I think it's very important to therefore, and this is part of what I've been trying to say, I think, to see that there is a regularity and an order and a balance, but that isn't an ironclad determinism. And if it was, you could understand the principles behind it all and work it out without actually seeing what actually is going on. Of course, in physics, I mean...
Should we come back to this evening? Because
Okay, let's go on. All right. Yeah.
Also, I might add that something like the resurrection is supernatural, isn't it? It's outside nature. But we could come back to that as well.
It's a big issue, so we can talk about it this evening if you want to.
Okay, let's have...
Just a comment which I think might be worth looking at, because it does lead into a more contemporary thing. Carrying on from what Brian was saying, I happen to be one of those who's sort of firmly stuck in the past, as I rather like the writings of William Temple, Archbishop of Canterbury, during the last war. And I've forgotten exactly where it said. He was speaking about miracles. And you've got to remember that William Temple started off somewhat liberal. He couldn't get ordained because he didn't believe in the virgin birth initially, and various questions like that. And he was saying that he felt that the occasional miracle was in accordance with a belief in God. If you believe that God exists, you have to be open to the miraculous as an occasional thing. Now that has been taken up by Arthur Peacock in an article, paper he wrote on William Temple, which is really saying that if you follow that line, you end up with a capricious God. And I think this is sort of coming out with the two things, that I think if you so emphasize the uniformity of nature as an expression of a orderly God, you can end up saying it's got to be only ordered in the way we understand it. Yet William Temple was open to call it the divine interruption, or whatever we like to call it. And I think that, has to be there. I know that there's the other side, that I think there are those who are too willing to accept a miracle, and I'm thinking particularly here of a certain philosopher of religion in a certain American university, which I think I better mention. It is Notre Dame, and he, in one of his articles, was really coming out virtually with the statement: if you really can't explain something, this means you can evoke a miracle. I think Ernan will be able to give me the reference, will you not? But I do think we have to see it as something rather more, and I don't know quite how you would develop all this with, the idea of a basic uniformity of nature and being open to some kind of, let's say, supernatural involvement, call it what you like.
You see, the great danger is I think that to invoke a miracle too quickly is obviously wrong, and to say, well, it must be a miracle. But I'm very opposed to the opposing view, to say there could never be a miracle. And I think that's the tension that we're facing. And of course, there are theological problems about divine intervention, because once you say, I think the word capricious was used, and that does, in a sense, raise the problem, because take healing miracles, which obviously are central to the New Testament, but if somebody prays for a cure and is cured, and somebody else prays for a cure and isn't, why? It is very difficult, and it creates as many problems as it solves. But I don't want to get into the position of saying, and again, it's a philosophical position, not a scientific one, of saying science must explain everything, even if we can't at the moment. And then it's just as wrong to say, oh, well, science can't explain that because we don't happen to be able to do it today.
Let's going to be more than we can fill tonight, so that's a good reason to get these bits of paper and fill them in for this evening.
I'm interested in the question of the contingency of order. In the recent book by Nick Everett called The Non-Existence of God, he argues that we can't even so much as form a conception of a world which would be truly chaotic, truly disordered. If that argument is forceful, then there wouldn't be any question about why the world is an ordered place. It's necessarily ordered. There would be a question of why this order rather than that, but no question that it could possibly be chaotic. We can't even form a conception of things that are chaotic, because even to form a conception of a thing is itself to presuppose order. What would your take be on that?
And I think the way you put it is quite interesting. We can't form a conception, and we couldn't live in a world that wasn't ordered, and we wouldn't be there. I mean, in a way, this goes back to things like the anthropic principle, in a way, I suppose. But certainly, we couldn't live in a totally chaotic world. Our minds can't make sense of that. We're geared up to order, certainly. What has to be the case? What are the presuppositions of that, of the fact that we, being as we are, have to live in an ordered world? Well, his conclusion seemed to be that there isn't a God then. From that,
he's a strenuous atheist.
Yes.
I always like to keep up with enemy manoeuvres.
No, quite. But I mean, I don't quite see why he gets from that to atheism, because it would seem to me to be quite a strong argument for theism, that given that we have to exist in an ordered world, and given that therefore this is an ordered world because we are existing here, where does the order come from?
Yes, I think he would agree that there's a question as to why one particular order should exist as opposed to any other. But I think he's saying that we can't form a conception of true disorder. He would say means that we can't speak of any possibility of there being a disorder, even one independent of our own existence and mind, whether or not we were here.
There's almost a whiff about positivism about that, I feel, isn't there? That you can't conceive of something. I don't know. I would have thought that. I mean, obviously, we can't have a conception of. I mean, it's like saying we can't think of nothing. I mean, Plato used to get very worried about that, and because he'd say, well, it's not thinking of anything. So, I mean, and this, of course, is very relevant when we're talking about creation from nothing and so on. I mean, there are limits to what we can think. And there are limits to, but what does that say? What are the presuppositions behind that? I mean, what does the world have to be like that, such that that is true? And it doesn't seem to me that it shows that, for instance, there couldn't be chaos. We wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't be having any conceptions. I mean, it's a fact about the human mind, which is a contingent fact.
But if there could be chaos, if that's to amount to anything, we should surely be able to specify what criteria must
that's
be
why I
met
say it's
in order
positivist.
For something to count as truly chaotic.
But that's a positivist view, isn't it? It's like saying you've got to be able to know how to verify it. I mean, why, if it's beyond the limits of what the human mind can properly imagine, I don't see how we can start specifying it. But obviously, I mean, it would be the total breakdown of everything that we're accustomed to. But I mean, I think one could imagine, in a sense, the denial of all of this.
I wonder if it's a question of being verifying so much as even conceiving of.
Yeah, but conceiving, you see, that's a human thing, isn't it? It's about us, not about the world. Anyway, it's a big issue.
Yes. So you described metaphysical realism as an indispensable presupposition of science, rather
Absolutely.
than, that is, say, a plausible interpretation or a way of explaining its success or something like that. And so, granted that metaphysical realism has a lot to recommend itself, I want to ask about this understanding of it as a presupposition. I mean, suppose we had a community of Berkeleyan idealists. It seems as if they could engage in an activity that would be trying to systematically order their experiences of the world in much the same way as our scientific activity. Indeed, it seems that they could participate in a common enterprise with us and yet have a different understanding of what of scientific activity. So
because there's just a kind of assumption that we all agree in our subjective experiences, is there?
Well,
I mean, the trouble about Berkeleyan idealism is that you're realist about other people and you're realist about God, aren't you, really? I mean, and God is underpinning the whole thing. So actually, the whole thing itself only works in a realist framework anyway. That's what I think. I mean, otherwise, I think it does rather break down. I mean, the point about that kind of idealism is that actually, you see, it's not actually opposed totally to metaphysical realism. It's not totally opposed to metaphysics. It's just emphasizing the primacy of mind over matter, really. I mean, that's the prime thing it's doing there, isn't it? It's the primacy of the mind. But other minds and God are real.
That's right, but I guess much of the material world is rather different than the way that we common sense realists think about it, right?
Yes. I mean, I agree that therefore the way you conceive the world is different, but there's enough realism there for I think the thing not to break down anyway.
One last question. I saw this hand go up first. And then we'll start with you.
Is there any non-circular justification for our belief that there's uniformity of nature? If there isn't, then how can we be justified in believing that science is a good guide to, or a reliable guide to truth? Because the whole assumption of science has to base on our belief that there's uniformity of nature.
Yes. Well, you said non-circular. If I said, well, God made it that way, do you think that's still circular? I mean, it's invoking something other than nature. I mean, we're then bent to religion. I mean, we've got other issues, but I don't see that circular.
Yeah, but people will ask, then what is our justification of believing in God?
I know, but then you're in a different issue. And that isn't circular, is it? I mean, we're not talking about nature. We're talking about something else. I mean, more interesting question, I suppose, is a non-circular way of justifying rationality, which is I mean, I think rationality is an indispensable, again, let me use that word, presupposition. I mean, the whole thing breaks down unless we assume a basic rationality.
Great. Well, we can all be rational beings and go and have lunch, and we can discuss whether we're really having lunch or not while we're having it.
Yeah.